Blood soaked the imported white orchids, pooling around the shattered crystal of the champagne tower. It was supposed to be the society wedding of the decade. But one whispered confession, caught only by a blind man's heightened senses, was all it took to turn a sacred vow into a massacre. To Oliver Hayes, the world was no longer a canvas of colors and light, but a deeply intricate tapestry of sound, temperature, and scent. He had lost his sight 2 years ago on a rain-slicked highway, a tragedy the police had officially ruled a devastating hit-and-run. His optic nerves were completely severed, plunging the gentle Omega into a world of permanent darkness. Yet in the absence of his vision, his remaining senses had sharpened to an almost agonizing degree. Today, those heightened senses were torturing him. Oliver sat perfectly still in the second row of the sprawling Gothic Cathedral of St. Jude's in upstate New York. The air was thick, suffocatingly so, with the fragrance of 10,000 blooming white lilies, imported specifically at the bride's request. But beneath the cloying floral arrangement lay the heavy, oppressive pheromones of the East Coast's most elite families. At the altar stood Dominic Hastings. Even without eyes, Oliver knew exactly where the alpha was standing. Dominic's scent was completely unique to Oliver, a rich, grounding aroma of rain-soaked cedar and crushed mint. Today, however, that familiar cedar was laced with the sour, acrid spike of pure distress. Dominic was suffering. Oliver's hands, clad in soft leather gloves to hide the pale, scarred skin of his knuckles, gripped the smooth wood of his cane. Beside him, his loyal best friend, Simon Walker, a sturdy beta who had become Oliver's anchor in the dark, placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to stay for the vows, Ollie," Simon whispered, his voice barely audible over the low hum of the wealthy congregation. "We can leave right now. No one would blame you." "I have to stay, Simon," Oliver murmured back, keeping his face turned slightly toward the altar. "He asked me to be here." The reality was a bitter pill that Oliver swallowed every single day. Dominic and Oliver had been childhood sweethearts. Their bond was something out of a fairy tale, a powerful magnetic pull between a dominant alpha heir and a sweet-natured Omega. They were meant to be mated. They had even chosen the rings. But the Hastings Corporation, a multi-billion-dollar shipping empire, had faced a catastrophic financial collapse exactly 1 month after Oliver's tragic car accident. In a vulnerable, broken state, dealing with a newly blinded partner and a crumbling legacy, Dominic had been backed into a corner by his ruthless father, Reginald Hastings. The Montgomery family, old money, vast political influence, and deep pockets had offered a bailout. The price was Dominic's hand in marriage to their only daughter, Victoria Montgomery. It was positioned as a duty, a necessary sacrifice to save thousands of jobs and the Hastings legacy. Oliver, loving Dominic too much to watch him lose everything, had broken their engagement himself, stepping aside so Dominic could do what was required. Dominic had fought, raged, and wept, but the sheer weight of his family's survival had eventually crushed his resistance. Now Dominic was marrying an Omega he did not love, and Oliver was sitting in the pews, listening to the destruction of his own heart. "Here she comes," Simon muttered, his tone dripping with quiet disdain. The heavy oak doors of the cathedral groaned open, and the string quartet transitioned into a sweeping, dramatic bridal march. A hush fell over the crowd. Oliver felt the shift in the air pressure as the massive doors let in a gust of crisp autumn wind. Then came the scent. Victoria Montgomery's pheromones were overwhelmingly sweet, like overripe peaches and spun sugar. But to Oliver, there had always been an underlying metallic tang to her, something cold and synthetic that made his Omega instincts recoil. He listened to the rhythmic shh, shh of her heavy silk gown dragging across the marble floor. He heard the collective gasps of admiration from the high society guests. But what Oliver focused on was Dominic. As the bride drew closer, Dominic's cedar scent spiked with a sudden, violent wave of nausea and resignation. The Alpha was standing at the altar, preparing to bind his soul and his empire to a woman he despised. Oliver squeezed his eyes shut behind his dark glasses. He could feel a migraine building at the base of his skull. The combination of the heavy incense, the overpowering pheromones of 300 alphas and omegas, and the sheer emotional agony of the moment was becoming too much for his fragile nervous system. "Simon," Oliver gasped softly, clutching his cane. I need a minute. I can't breathe." Simon immediately caught the panic in Oliver's voice. He hooked his arm through Oliver's. "I've got you. Let's step out. The side antechamber is empty. Come on." Carefully, they slipped out of their pew just as the priest began the opening invocation. Nobody paid them any mind. All eyes were fixed on the glittering spectacle at the altar. Simon guided Oliver down a narrow side aisle, their footsteps muffled by the thick crimson carpet, until the heavy double doors of the cathedral's velvet-draped antechamber closed behind them, cutting off the priest's echoing voice. The antechamber, known to the cathedral staff as the Velvet Room, was blessedly quiet. The air here was cool, smelling only of old paper, polished mahogany, and burning beeswax candles. Oliver slumped against a high-backed leather chair, taking deep, shuddering breaths to clear the heavy pheromones from his lungs. "I'll get you some water," Simon said, his voice laced with concern. "There's a staff kitchen just down the hall. Don't move. I'll be right back." "I won't," Oliver promised, resting his forehead against the cool knob of his cane. The door clicked shut, leaving Oliver alone in the silence. For a moment, he allowed himself to cry. A single tear slipped from beneath his dark glasses, tracing a warm path down his cheek. He had thought he was strong enough to attend. He thought he owed it to Dominic to prove that he would survive this. But the reality of hearing Dominic pledge his life to Victoria was an agony he hadn't fully prepared for. 5 minutes passed. The faint, muffled sounds of the ceremony continued on the other side of the thick stone walls. Suddenly, the heavy iron latch of the antechamber's secondary door, the one leading from the private bridal prep suites, clicked open. Oliver froze. He didn't speak. His instinct, honed by 2 years of vulnerability in the dark, told him to remain completely still. He shrank back into the deep shadows of the high-backed chair, pulling his legs in. 2 sets of footsteps entered the room. One was heavy, the confident stride of a man in dress shoes. The other was lighter, the sharp, unmistakable click of designer heels. Then came the scent. Overripe peaches and spun sugar. Victoria Montgomery. Oliver's breath caught in his throat. Why wasn't she at the altar? Had something happened? He strained his ears, listening intently. "You are insane for pulling me in here right before the vows, Felix," Victoria hissed. Her voice, usually carefully modulated for the public, was sharp and venomous. "You haven't answered my calls in 3 days, Victoria," the man, Felix, replied. His voice was trembling, tight with anxiety. He smelled distinctly of a beta, lacking the heavy dominance of an alpha or the sweet lure of an omega. But he reeked of fear. "I needed to know if you're actually going through with this. if you're actually going to let Dominic Hastings claim that child." Oliver's heart slammed against his ribs. Child? Dominic hadn't mentioned anything about a pregnancy. "Keep your voice down, you idiot!" Victoria snapped, the rustle of her heavy silk gown loud in the quiet room. "Of course I am going through with it. Do you have any idea how much power the Montgomerys will have once our bloodline is merged with the Hastings empire? Dominic is an honorable, tragically noble fool. He thinks we slept together that night after the gala when he was blackout drunk on suppression suppressants. He truly believes the baby I'm carrying is his." "But it's mine," Felix said, his voice breaking. "It's my baby, Victoria. It's an heir to a shipping conglomerate, Felix." "That's what it is," Victoria said coldly. "Dominic is marrying me out of duty to a phantom world. Once the vows are spoken and the merger is signed in blood, it won't matter what he finds out later. The Montgomerys will own him." Behind the chair, Oliver clamped a hand over his own mouth to stifle a gasp. Dominic wasn't just marrying Victoria for a financial bailout. He was marrying her because he believed he had compromised her, that he had fathered a child during a medically induced rut blackout. It was a trap, a meticulously planned trap. "I don't like this," Felix paced the room, his dress shoes scuffing the wood floor. "What if the Hastings find out? What if that blind ex of his says something? I saw him out there. Oliver Hayes is sitting in the second row. Dominic never stopped looking at him." Victoria let out a low, cruel laugh that made the hairs on Oliver's arms stand up. "The blind Omega, please, let him sit there and cry behind his little sunglasses," Victoria sneered. "He's pathetic, and if he ever becomes a real problem, I'll deal with him permanently." "Like you did last time?" Felix whispered, his tone dropping into a horrified register. "Exactly like last time," Victoria said, her voice dripping with ice. "It cost me $50,000 to have that truck run his little sedan off the bridge 2 years ago. I paid for a corpse, Felix. The fact that he only lost his eyes was a frustrating disappointment. But if he dares to interfere with my marriage today, I will make sure the next driver finishes the job. I won't miss twice." In the shadows, Oliver stopped breathing entirely. The pieces of his shattered life slammed together with sickening force. The night of the crash, the blinding headlights of the truck that had crossed 3 lanes of traffic just to hit him. The police officer who had quickly closed the case, citing a lack of evidence. It hadn't been an accident. It had been a calculated hit. Victoria Montgomery had orchestrated the destruction of his life, stealing his sight and his future, all to clear the path to Dominic and the Hastings fortune. A violent, uncontrollable shudder racked Oliver's body. The sheer terror and blinding rage crashing through him caused his own scent, usually a soft, comforting chamomile, to flare sharply into burnt honey and ozone. Victoria stopped speaking. The rustling of her dress ceased. "Did you hear that?" she whispered sharply. Oliver clamped his hands over his mouth, tears streaming down his face, his chest burning from the lack of oxygen. Victoria took a slow step toward the corner of the room. "Someone's in here. I can smell an Omega in distress." Click, click, click. Her heels moved closer to the high-backed leather chair where Oliver was hiding. He felt around frantically in the dark for his cane, his hands shaking so violently he could barely grip the wood. If she found him, she would know he heard everything. If she found him, she wouldn't wait for a truck. She would end him right here in the velvet room. Click, click. She was right beside the chair. Just as her hand brushed the leather upholstery, the main doors to the antechamber swung open with a loud bang. "Ollie? I got the water. Sorry it took..." Oh, excuse me. Simon's voice boomed into the room, immediately freezing the tension. Victoria stepped back quickly, her scent instantly masking into something sweet and benign. "Oh, no apologies needed," she said, her voice dripping with fake, sugary warmth. "I just tore a layer of tulle on my underskirt. Felix was helping me pin it before I walked down the aisle. We were just leaving." "Right. Congratulations," Simon said dryly. Oliver heard Victoria and Felix hurry past Simon, their footsteps retreating down the hallway toward the cathedral's main entrance. Once the door clicked shut, Simon rushed over to the chair. "Oliver, are you okay? You're shaking like a leaf. Your scent is completely sour." "Simon!" Oliver gasped, grabbing his friend's lapels with surprising, desperate strength. His voice was a harsh, broken rasp. "Get me up! Get me up right now!" "Ollie, what's wrong? You're having a panic attack." "I am not having a panic attack," Oliver said, standing up, his knuckles turning white as he gripped his cane. The quiet, gentle Omega was gone, replaced by a wound righteous fury. He turned his sightless eyes toward the heavy doors leading back into the cathedral. "Take me to the altar, Simon, now." Before he says, "I do." The heavy oak doors of the main sanctuary groaned as Simon pushed them open, the sound echoing like a gunshot through the cavernous space of St. Jude's. Inside, the massive cathedral was suffocatingly silent, save for the rhythmic, sonorous voice of Bishop Harrison echoing from the altar. "Should anyone present know of any reason that this couple should not be joined in holy matrimony, speak now or forever hold your peace." It was a mere formality, a traditional line spoken at thousands of weddings, completely ignored by the high society guests who were already anticipating the champagne reception. But today, the silence that followed was violently shattered. Clack, clack, clack. The sharp, rhythmic sound of Oliver's wooden cane striking the polished marble floor rang out. Every head in the cathedral turned. The sudden wave of gasps and shifting silk created a physical wave of air pressure that washed over Oliver. "I have a reason," Oliver said. His voice was not a shout, but in the acoustically perfect cathedral, it carried an undeniable, piercing clarity. "And it is a reason of blood, deception, and murder." The congregation erupted, a chaotic maelstrom of pheromones, shocked betas, enraged alphas, and terrified omegas flooded the air, threatening to overwhelm Oliver's senses. The scent of panic was thick and metallic, masking the cloying sweetness of the thousands of white lilies. Beside him, Simon stood like a physical shield, his beta presence grounding and steady. "Oliver!" The voice came from the altar, raw, bewildered, and laced with an agonizing mixture of hope and heartbreak. It was Dominic. The alpha's scent of rain-soaked cedar surged, cutting through the polluted air of the sanctuary. Oliver could hear the rustle of Dominic's heavy velvet suit as he instinctively took a step down from the altar, abandoning his bride. "Dominic, stay where you are," thundered Reginald Hastings. The patriarch's heavy, oppressive alpha aura rolled down the aisle like a physical threat. "Security, remove this Omega at once. He is having a mental break." "Don't touch him," Dominic roared, his own alpha presence flaring so violently that several guests in the front rows whimpered and covered their necks. "Let him speak." "Dominic, darling, please," Victoria pleaded, her voice trembling with manufactured tears. Her overripe peach scent spiked, desperately trying to project innocence. "He's sick. The accident ruined his mind. He doesn't know what he's saying. He's just jealous." Oliver gripped his cane, his knuckles aching against the smooth wood. He didn't flinch under the weight of 300 staring eyes he couldn't see. He focused solely on Dominic's scent. "I may be blind, Victoria," Oliver said, his voice dropping to a dangerous icy register that sent shivers through the front rows. "But my hearing is perfect, and I heard every single word you whispered to Felix in the Velvet Room not 5 minutes ago." A sharp collective gasp rippled through the crowd. At the altar, the rustling of Victoria's heavy silk gown abruptly stopped. The sweet, sugary scent she had been projecting soured instantly, turning rancid. "I have no idea what you're talking about," she hissed, her voice losing its sweet modulation. "Felix is here?" Dominic asked, his voice low, dangerously calm. "Victoria's assistant?" "Not just her assistant, Dominic," Oliver said, stepping further into the aisle, guided by Simon's steady hand. "He is the father of the child she is carrying." Pandemonium broke out in the pews. The Montgomery family, seated in the front left rows, erupted into shouts of outrage. Reginald Hastings turned a terrifying shade of purple, bellowing for silence. "You're lying!" Victoria shrieked, her facade finally cracking. "He's lying! Dominic, he's just a bitter, broken Omega who couldn't keep you. He made this up." "Did I make up the fact that you planned this?" Oliver countered, raising his chin, letting his own pure, righteous anger flood the room. "Did I make up the fact that you preyed on Dominic while he was heavily sedated on rut suppressants, tricking him into believing he compromised you? You manufactured a fake pregnancy with an alpha heir to force a corporate merger. You used a child to buy a shipping empire." Dominic's breathing became ragged, heavy pants echoing over the microphone clipped to the bishop's robes. "Victoria, tell me he's lying," Dominic demanded. His voice sounded hollowed out, a man standing on the edge of a precipice. "He is," Victoria sobbed, though the panic in her pheromones betrayed her entirely. "Where is the proof? Where is this so-called confession? Felix isn't even in the sanctuary." "Actually," Simon interrupted, his voice booming with beta authority, "he's right here." The heavy oak doors swung open again. 2 of the Hastings private security guards, whom Simon had intercepted in the vestibule, dragged a trembling, pale man down the center aisle. Felix was weeping openly, his knees buckling with every step. The sheer, crushing weight of Dominic's enraged alpha aura was suffocating the smaller man. "Felix!" Dominic snarled, stepping fully off the altar and advancing down the aisle. The cedar scent was no longer comforting. It was a raging forest fire, demanding absolute submission. "Tell me the truth." Felix fell to his knees on the crimson carpet, sobbing hysterically. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, Mr. Hastings. She made me do it. She said if I didn't play along, the Montgomerys would ruin me. It's my baby. We've been sleeping together for a year." A collective shriek went up from the Montgomery family. Victoria's father, a formidable political figure, stood up, his face ashen, realizing their family's reputation was evaporating in real time. "You useless, pathetic coward!" Victoria screamed, abandoning all pretense. She lunged forward, grabbing the heavy brass microphone stand from the altar and throwing it furiously into the pews. "That isn't all," Oliver said, his voice slicing through the chaos one final, fatal time. "The child was just the trap to secure the marriage. But clearing the path, that required blood." Oliver turned his sightless face directly toward where Victoria stood. 2 years ago, a truck ran my sedan off the interstate. It severed my optic nerves. The police called it a hit and run. But in the Velvet Room, Victoria admitted it was a paid assassination. She paid $50,000 for a corpse. Dominic. She paid to have me murdered, so she could have you. The sanctuary descended into a silence so profound, so absolute, it felt like a vacuum had sucked the air from the room. Dominic stopped moving. He stood frozen in the center aisle, exactly halfway between his blind, broken former fiancée and the woman he had almost bound his soul to. The silence stretched for one unbearable second. 2. And then the alpha snapped. A guttural, horrifying roar ripped from Dominic's throat. It was a sound of pure, primal devastation. He turned slowly toward Victoria, his eyes completely dilated, the human man entirely overtaken by the protective, territorial rage of a wronged alpha. "You did this," Dominic whispered, his voice vibrating with a lethal promise. "You took his eyes. You took him from me." Realizing she had lost everything, the marriage, the merger, her freedom, and her social standing, Victoria's survival instincts took a dark, twisted turn. If she was going down, she would ensure her failure wasn't left standing to gloat. "I should have paid 100,000, Victoria shrieked, a wild, unhinged laugh bubbling from her lips. In a blur of motion, she spun around, grabbing the ornate, heavy ceremonial sword used for cutting the towering, 7-tier wedding cake resting on a crystal table near the altar. The blade was sharp, forged from heavy steel. "If I can't have the Hastings Empire, neither can a blind freak." Victoria vaulted off the altar steps with terrifying speed, her heavy silk gown ripping at the seams as she charged down the aisle directly at Oliver. Her overripe peach scent turned entirely to acid and malice. "Oliver, move!" Simon yelled, trying to pull his friend backward. But in the crowded aisle, with the heavy wooden pews blocking their escape, they were boxed in. Oliver stumbled, his cane clattering to the floor. He couldn't see the blade coming, but he heard the furious rustle of silk and the sharp intake of breath from the crowd. He braced himself for the piercing pain, closing his sightless eyes. But the blow never connected with him. A heavy mass slammed into the space directly in front of Oliver. There was a sickening, brutal sound of metal slicing through flesh and expensive fabric, followed by a wet, heavy gasp. Warm liquid splattered across Oliver's pale cheek. The overwhelming scent of rain-soaked cedar, now aggressively laced with the sharp metallic tang of fresh blood, filled his nostrils. "Dominic!" Oliver screamed, falling to his knees as a heavy body collapsed against him. Dominic had crossed the distance in a fraction of a second, throwing himself between Victoria's blade and Oliver. The ceremonial sword had driven deep into Dominic's shoulder, narrowly missing his collarbone, the momentum carrying all three of them crashing into the towering champagne arrangement at the end of the aisle. Glass shattered in a deafening crescendo. Hundreds of crystal coops rained down, mixing with the imported white orchids that lined the pews. Blood soaked the pristine white petals, pooling around the shattered crystal of the champagne tower, turning the sparkling wine a horrific shade of crimson. "Get her off him! Hold her down!" Reginald Hastings bellowed over the screams of the guests. Private security swarmed the aisle, tackling Victoria to the marble floor. She thrashed and screamed like a feral animal, the heavy sword clattering away into the darkness under the pews. Oliver was entirely unaware of the chaos around him. He was on the floor amidst the broken glass and crushed orchids, his hands frantically feeling over Dominic's chest, his fingers coming away slick and wet. "Dominic, please, please," Oliver sobbed, pressing his hands desperately against the wound on the alpha's shoulder to staunch the bleeding. "Why did you do that? You idiot! Why did you do that?" Dominic coughed, a wet, rattling sound, but a weak, tired chuckle followed. His large, warm hand came up, gently cupping Oliver's face, smearing blood against the Omega's cheek. "I promised to protect you, Ollie," Dominic whispered, his breathing shallow. "I failed you 2 years ago. I let them force me away from you. I wasn't going to let her hurt you again." "You're bleeding so much," Oliver cried, leaning his forehead against Dominic's. His own soft chamomile scent flared, wrapping around the injured Alpha in a desperate attempt to soothe him. "Simon, call an ambulance." "Already on it, Ollie. They're 3 minutes out," Simon yelled, kneeling beside them with a stack of linen napkins ripped from a nearby catering table, pressing them over Oliver's hands to add pressure to the wound. Sirens began to wail in the distance, a rapidly approaching crescendo that cut through the hysterical crying of the congregation. The Montgomerys were furiously arguing with the Hastings security, trying to shield Victoria from view, but it was useless. The police burst through the heavy oak doors, followed closely by paramedics. "Hands behind your back! Do not resist!" an officer shouted, hauling a screaming Victoria up from the marble floor. The cold click of handcuffs echoed in the cavernous space. As the paramedics swarmed Dominic, gently pulling Oliver back to load the Alpha onto a stretcher, Dominic reached out blindly. Oliver caught his hand, lacing their fingers together, ignoring the blood that coated them both. "Don't let go," Dominic rasped, his eyes fluttering shut as the blood loss took its toll. "Please, Ollie, come with me." "I'm right here, Dom. I'm not going anywhere," Oliver promised, a fierce, unbreakable resolve settling over him. He allowed Simon to guide him as he walked alongside the stretcher, the chaotic noise of the ruined wedding fading into the background. The heavy oak doors of St. Jude's closed behind them, leaving the shattered champagne glasses, the blood-soaked orchids, and the ruined Montgomery legacy behind in the suffocating silence of the sanctuary. The truth had finally been spoken, dragging them both out of the dark. And as they stepped into the crisp autumn air, toward the waiting ambulance, Oliver realized that for the first time in 2 years, he didn't need his eyes to see that his future was finally clear. Did the blind Omega's fierce bravery and the Alpha's ultimate sacrifice leave you breathless? If you loved this dramatic, twist-filled Omegaverse tale of betrayal, revenge, and true love's redemption, hit that like button right now. Don't forget to share this story with your friends who love high-stakes romance, and subscribe to our channel for more intense, immersive storytelling and thrilling audio dramas. Drop a comment below. What would you have done in Oliver's shoes? See you next time.